Okay, hi, welcome everybody. Ohayo gozaimasu. So today, thank you. Today, we're starting the second day of the conference with a keynote talk by Alson Mountz from Wilfrid Laurier University. And the title of her talk is Island Detention and Asylum's Afterlives. And so this will be a talk for 45 minutes, followed by some questions and discussion time. So thank you.
And to show this. How do I show the PowerPoint on? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here early this morning, and thank you so much, thanks, to Professor Takashi Yamazaki and the whole local team here who's worked so hard to organize this wonderful conference. I found the lectures yesterday so stimulating and inspiring, and I'm looking forward to the conversations as they continue today and tomorrow. Today I'm going to cover a lot of ground, a lot of geography with my talk. So, I don't know, this doesn't want to advance. I'll just use this. Yeah, I'm pressing these. Oh, there, okay. It's okay, I can use the laptop. It's fine. Okay. Thank you. Because I'm covering a lot of ground, I want to offer up an argument, an outline, which you can see here, and some through lines, some patterns that you can see repeated in the places that I will cover in my talk. So I will argue that islands are central to understanding the contemporary politics of asylum, and there are many component parts of this argument. I'll trace some of the histories whereby, at first, islands may be spaces of encounter or access where asylum seekers may land there when they're traveling by boat in search of protection. It may be the closest bit of a sovereign territory that they can reach to access asylum. But over time, what happens is that states are reaching out and externalizing the border and building up the capacity to stop people, to detain them on islands, to mediate their access to sovereign territories where they can accrue the right to seek asylum, to make a claim for asylum. And much of this is premised on an idea we heard about yesterday, the geographical imagination of control, the idea that remoteness and isolation can happen on an island, which we know is not true. It runs counter to the ways that we've been talking about islands as relational, but this idea nonetheless propels forward much of the construction of infrastructure where people are detained. So on some of the islands that I'll be talking about, states are exploiting geography and communities with colonial histories, which means asymmetrical power relations and economic relationships, to use geography far away from mainland sovereign territories that people are trying to reach, where they can access not only the right to seek asylum legally for countries that are signatories to the convention relating to the status of refugees, but also resources to support those claims, such as legal representation, asylum procedures, interpreters, communities, and so on. And what happens over time is that in the ad hoc kind of crisis-driven responses to boat migration, which are heavily politicized, we see forms of policy experimentation where enforcement agendas are advanced and eventually become more formalized in policy and legislation. I'll be fleshing out all of these ideas as I go. And all of this results in an empirical pattern that we can see readily available when we map this detention growth on islands, where not only are there a buildup of detention facilities, but also the reproduction of the geographical form of the island. In other words, a proliferation of spaces of confinement within the island. Many of you will know the book by anthropologist David Vine, Island of Shame, which is about the forced removal of the indigenous Chagosians from Diego Garcia in the Chagos archipelago through the collusion of the US and UK governments to place the large base there. I was thinking about this yesterday in our conversations about bases. And I show you here a table from Vine's book. His archival research, he traces how this base came to be on Diego Garcia. And he goes back to the very idea of why bases were being built on islands as geostrategic locations during a period of decolonization when the US wanted to be able to exercise influence in the region and locate bases strategically. And the reason I put this table here, even though it's probably hard for you to read right now, is that some of the same places that the US imagined as strategic sites to locate bases also appear in my research on the detention of people who are seeking asylum. So not only are they sort of forward operating bases of influence, they also become forward operating bases of control of human mobility to mediate people's access to sovereign territory. So some of these places are being effectively repurposed today with infrastructure to detain people who are in search of protection. And so one of the kind of underlying themes of all of this work is that nation states that are signatories to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees who have signed on to protect people are using geography to undermine those commitments, to stop people from reaching their territories. And they're often doing this by transferring resources onto the sovereign territories of other countries and other communities. This is, of course, an iconic image and an important author in the realm of borderland studies, Gloria Anzaldúa, who says the U.S.-Mexican border es una herida abierta where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And I begin here because it's a site that captures so much discourse and debate on immigration in the United States, captures the geographical imagination of so many people as a highly politicized border crossing, perhaps because it's proximate and therefore more visible, particularly to the US population. But no less politicized, equally important and politicized are crossings that are happening by boat at sea, yet these are often less visible to the general public and to the media. We don't necessarily see them as easily or know what's happening at sea. And this also fuels the idea that what happens with enforcement at sea or on remote islands can be somehow hidden from view in this geographical imagination where things, people, information perhaps can be more readily controlled. And in these borderland spaces at sea and on islands, we see three key trends converging in global migration. One is a global rise in asylum claims, which is, of course, part of the global rise in displacement, now reaching historic highs at the exact moment when states are retreating from asylum and protection. Also, the transnational enforcement of borders or border externalization, so pushing borders farther away from the places where we imagine them on the political map, and enforcing borders deeper into the routes that people are traveling transnationally to get somewhere for protection. And then a remarkable global growth in detention, and I'll just show you a few images so you can have visuals of these trends and their convergence in borderlands at sea and on islands. The global rise in asylum claims means that in recent years, we see, as I said, kind of a mirroring of the larger statistic, which is the UNHCR now estimates that there are about 100 million people displaced around the globe. In terms of asylum figures during this 5-year period, in 2017, they had increased to about 3.1 million people around the globe who are awaiting the adjudication of their claims. Last year in 2022, so the next 5-year period, there were about 4.5 million people around the globe who were awaiting a decision on their asylum claims. Here's a visual on that global growth in detention from the Global Detention Project. which uses access to information requests to do country reports about detention policies around the world. You can see a remarkably vast infrastructure that has developed in a relatively short period of time. And it's important to note that many of the recent a lot of the recent buildup in infrastructure is in what are often thought of as kind of transit regions, so places that people are traveling to try to get somewhere. So, for example, there's been a lot of buildup of detention in Mexico, policies to get people to remain in Central America, detention in countries of North Africa, and on islands around Australia in the region. In this book, which I wrote with my wonderful co-author, Dr. Jenna Lloyd, Boats, Borders, and Bases, we argue that there's an important relationship between those land crossings that are highly politicized and made into what Nick DiGenova calls a spectacle. They capture our attention, but they distract us and obscure what's happening in other places. And this is a history of externalization that has been happening over decades with the movement of border enforcement farther away, the movement of the processing of people's asylum claims and their detention, so effectively the outsourcing of the management of claims, and the use of water, islands to mediate access through distance and invisibility. And what we argue in our book is that people pay so much attention to what's happening at the US-Mexico border that they miss an important history in the Caribbean, which involves the United States policing maritime borders in the Caribbean. And so I think any genealogy of externalization has to begin with this historical period of the United States policing Haitian and Cuban nationals traveling to US mainland territory across the Caribbean. And what we find when we go back to this period is that many of the practices that were implemented at sea actually form the basis for what we see happening around the globe now with regard to externalization practices that many countries have adapted. So the creation of naval buffer zones to stop people at sea, but also the use of particular kinds of programs and policies and infrastructure to target populations. I'll give you a couple of examples. These are happening onshore and offshore at the same time. So in 1978, what was then the Immigration and Naturalization Service in the US created something called the Haitian Program, which was to counter what they called in the archives the Haitian threat. So there were an increased number of Haitian nationals traveling by boat, and this program racialized Haitians, treating them differently from other people coming to the US, premised on the assumption that people were economic migrants rather than sort of bona fide, the idea of bona fide people being persecuted. And then this rationale was used to detain people in prison en masse, and statistics show that they were detained for longer periods of time and had expedited access to asylum. There was a class action lawsuit against this program so that it was ended within a couple of years. It was found to be discriminatory. And Jenna and I were able to read archives and testaments about the conditions of detention that Haitians endured in the United States at this time. So this is a quote from a man identified as BP, who said, "Maybe they will kill me in Haiti. The government doesn't forget anything there. But this is worse. This is no country for Black people." And in fact, in the court decision with the class action lawsuit, the judge found and said in his decision, never before has there been an expedited program designed to expel applicants for asylum. And he also noted that it was significant that this was the first mass migration of Black people in search of protection in the US against whom this program was formulated. And we can see the principles of this program being repeated elsewhere. For example, today in Mexico, where people are held en masse and have restricted access to asylum, to legal representation. So again, the idea of expediting their access to effectively deny it. This historical period planted seeds for, on the one hand, the vast infrastructure that developed within the US mainland territory to detain. So people were being held in detention at the Chrome facility in Miami and then were transferred to other places because the jail was overcrowded and there were protests inside and outside of it. So the US eventually ended up with the largest detention system in the world. But this was also a time where there was the development of the infrastructure to detain on islands in the Caribbean. And this is a pattern that repeats itself, that countries that have, even though they have the infrastructure to detain on their mainland, they're also developing the capacity to detain beyond the mainland in other territories. So this is a map of sites of U.S. military bases in the Caribbean that were identified for the detention of Haitian and Cuban nationals. And you can see the kind of correlation here between onshore and offshore regimes of detention. And of course, the most notorious among these was the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, where long before it became a site of the imprisonment of foreign enemy combatants in the global war on terror, this was where many Haitian and Cuban nationals were detained in a program that was euphemistically called Safe Haven. So what we found is that this historical period planted seeds that would be repeated over and over again and imported by other countries. The development of transnational deterrence regimes, the politicization and criminalization of people seeking asylum, the ad hoc kind of crisis-driven policies that begin as temporary measures, things like camps, shelters, but over time become normalized, often through legislation, and effectively a policy model for export that is really built on anti-Black racism. What we see over time is that these kinds of policies and practices are adapted by other governments. And they are all premised on what the US government was developing at that time, which they called the logic of prevention through deterrence, the idea that you could prevent more people from coming by deterring them in their journeys. And what follows is a series of migration crises over time and around the globe, which eventually we can assemble into a kind of history of externalization that gets denser and more expensive with greater investments in border enforcement and in the notion of prevention through deterrence over time until we get to the 2010s, the last 10 to 15 years, when we just see an absolutely frenetic investment, incredible investments in enforcement at sea and on islands. Now, this is a visual that shows you an increase in losses of life at sea in a period from 1990 to 2015. So what you can see is that as enforcement at sea intensified, so did precarity and deaths at sea. So although maritime enforcement is often narrated as humanitarian, as a form of rescue, what empirical research finds over and over again is that because there's more enforcement, people take greater risks and become more precarious. And so there are many people, researchers, activists, who are documenting border deaths at sea and at land crossings. So although, to put it succinctly, criminologist Sharon Pickering, who's based in Australia, says there's no evidence that asylum seeker deterrence policy works. And although social scientists effectively agree on this, these continue to be very politically popular policies because there's a lot of political will and support for border enforcement. And all of this history really has led me to this analysis, which is to say that I used to write a lot about the erosion of access to asylum, but in my most recent book, I write about the death of asylum. And this builds on the one hand, the fact that there are so many deaths of people happening. This is a small memorial that's built on Christmas Island, Australian overseas territory, to memorialize a terrible loss of life of 353 people who were on a boat. They were from Afghanistan and Iraq. The boat was on its way from Sumatra to Christmas Island and sank. And this incident, it's called the Civ X incident, is actually memorialized across Australia. The argument that I make related to the death of asylum is not just about the physical death of people, which is, of course, the starting point for so much of this research, but it's also about the ontological death. In other words, all of these measures to stop people from actually accessing asylum is making it nearly impossible to actually become a person seeking asylum. And this has an associated political death, which is to say, because these are things that are hidden from view so much of the time, many people don't know about them, so we don't see mass opposition or large political movements against them. So this genealogy of externalization and deaths at sea is closely, intimately linked to another phenomenon that I mentioned, which is island detention. And this is a map, it is not an exhaustive map, of sites, some of the sites where people seeking asylum have been detained on islands in recent years. This map is part of a project that I led, the Island Detention Project, which involved ethnographic and archival research on several of these islands, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about them. You'll see that the islands are, of course, in some of those politicized sites of crossing, where people are crossing economic disparities between regions, so a mix of people in search of protection and in search of livelihood, who often end up either landing intentionally or intercepted and then brought to an island for the processing of their claims for asylum. This is a photograph of Christmas Island. So again, we can see islands as central to the politics of changes to the process of seeking asylum. We can see policy experimentation happening there that becomes formalized, so that islands portend what is happening in the migration of governance in other places. So Australia is one of the key countries that has imported the model that I explained to you of what was happening in the Caribbean. And an important moment to visit here is Australia's Pacific Solution, which was implemented in 2001. This was an incident where there was another migrant ship traveling not far from Christmas Island, and the ship was in distress, and a Norwegian freighter, the MV Tampa, according to maritime law, was required to rescue people who were imperiled on the ship, and so it did. And then Prime Minister John Howard, who was not doing well in the polls and in the lead up to the election, used this political moment to declare that no more asylum seekers would be able to make it to Australian mainland territory to have their claims processed. And this was the beginning of what was called the Pacific Solution, which utilized, again, other islands' territories to outsource the processing of claims and detention of people, including on Christmas Island, overseas Australian territory, and Papua New Guinea's Manus Island and Nauru. And part of this was the creation of a two-tier system where people who were detained on the islands had more restricted access to asylum. So, for example, it was hard to get legal representation. There were fewer rights to appeal. And another very controversial part of this was something called excision legislation, where Australian Parliament met that September and retroactively declared bits of Australia, at first the island bits and borders, to be no longer part of Australia for the purposes of migration, so that if people who were not Australian landed there, they were not legally in Australia. Eventually there were additional rounds of excision passed, so that all of Australia was eventually declared to be no longer part of Australia for the purposes of migration. So this is something that geographers often write about as legal geographies, the way that these kind of fictions are produced through the law using geography. The photograph you see on the left is a photograph I took of the Christmas Island, the Northwest Point Immigration Detention Center. It's a very controversial facility that was built and opened in 2008. It cost over $400 million. It's a high-security facility. It's built in the middle of a nature reserve on an island that's known for ecotourism, for its unique flora and fauna, for the migration of unique crab species. So in addition to the dehumanization of people who were eventually detained in the facility and two others on the island, this was controversial for a whole range of reasons, and part of a broader spatial pattern that Australia has embarked upon across the region, which involves basically the geographical spread of enforcement, border enforcement, and detention across the region, so including many facilities across Indonesia, for example, which is not a signatory to the convention. So people enter into prolonged periods of limbo there, legal limbo, psychological, geographical limbo. Islands often have histories of being safe haven, places of passage where people might originally land and make their way from Christmas Island to Australia, from Lampedusa into Italy or the EU. But over time, this buildup happens to detain and stop people's journeys, and so the capacity to detain there grows. And within the island, what we found in the research is that we see the reproduction of these spaces of isolation. So more and more forms of segregation, the use of solitary confinement, the construction of islands within islands as they are geographically imagined as spaces of control. And these patterns, of course, are premised on racism, on fear, dehumanization, and distancing, all kinds of distancing of people, such that we end up with a map of enforcement in the region that looks like this, where again you can see that pattern of both the onshore capacity to detain on the mainland and its extension onto other territories in the region. Of course, it's individuals who are embarking on these journeys and households and communities that bear a huge burden in relation to these enforcement practices as they navigate these politicized fields of enforcement. This is an individual journey map of an ethnic Hazara man who left Afghanistan and made 4 separate journeys to try to reach Australia. The solid lines are his movement forward, the dotted lines are his deportation routes. And so you can see that this map shows, it's very emblematic of what transnational journeys for asylum are now like. They involve people crossing multiple borders, spending time in multiple sites of detention in multiple national contexts and periods of years of trying to reach someplace. This is based on an interview that we did with him when he was in Perth detention on the west coast of Australia, but he'd also been detained in Indonesia, on Christmas Island, and other places. So if it was true once upon a time that the primary spatial metaphor of crossing the border was the idea of crossing the line, so maybe if you picture that image I showed you of the US-Mexico border, now I think the spatial metaphor is one of confinement. So the border almost takes on the shape of the island as people experience repeated episodes of confinement on ships and in detention facilities over periods of many years. Anne Stoller writes about imperialism as a form of ruination, an actively ongoing, unfolding, churning process that's still remaking island landscapes. And Pacific scholar Katrina Taewa writes about this process of ruination on Pacific islands, particularly Banaba Island, and she traces out the histories of particular forms of extraction, looking particularly at phosphate extraction and exploitation, and that way that this is then converted into forms of an economy of managing human mobility over time. I'm going to quote her here. She says, "Phosphate histories reveal Australia's deep, organic, and often exploitative relationship with Pacific islands and the imperial structures upon which contemporary Australia-Pacific relations are built." And Taiwa wants to reframe Tongan academic writer Epeli Haufa's conceptualization of the Pacific as a sea of islands. She wants to conceptualize it as a sea of phosphate, in which both rocks and people flow across cultural and political borders. And all of this amazing work going on colonial histories and imperialism on islands corresponds and intersects with migration scholars who are writing about colonial forms of violence that are being reproduced in border enforcement as a form of harm against people who are on the move. So forms of segregation, isolation, and confinement intersect in these places. And we can carry Taiwa's analysis to what's happening on Christmas Island. Christmas Island was settled by the British Phosphate Mining Commission in the 1890s. Indentured workers were brought there from Singapore, from Malaysia, from China. And over time, the phosphate was extracted, and eventually the mining shut down in the 1980s, laying the groundwork for new economies to come in, including the buildup of detention. Although I think it's important to note in all of the islands where we did research, there were originally people who were welcoming of people landing there, and who also protested the construction of detention facilities. But then things grow more complicated as the detention industry overtakes the economy of the island. So, for example, on Christmas Island, we interviewed people who were working for the first time and working in the facility. But I should say people who work in the detention facility have to sign non-disclosure agreements. They're not actually allowed to discuss their work there. And what we did find, though, was a lot of speaking out and protest about some of the environmental harm that was happening on the island. So you can see this image saying, "Slow down, stop killing the crabs." And on the island, there were people who were making maps of crab deaths to raise people's awareness of the environmental harm of the increased traffic and population on the island, what this was doing to the local environment. But also off-island, there were people making maps of border deaths at sea, of people who were on their way to Christmas Island. So I think of the crabs as sort of the death, the physical violence that people on the island were able to speak about. I mentioned the proliferation of spaces of confinement within the island as an example. After that high-security detention facility was opened, it was quickly renovated to increase the number of solitary confinement cells that were there, and then it was used as a site of punishment so that people who were protesting or on hunger strikes or suicide watch in other parts of the Australian detention system were flown to Christmas Island to be placed in solitary confinement. And so we see carceral spaces multiplying, and I think of this as the construction of a solitary confinement cell within a high-security facility on a remote island surrounded by rough seas where there's a very small community and no chance of escape as the construction of an island within an island within an island. And a lot of research out of Australia has shown that remote detention and prolonged detention are very harmful to people's physical and mental health. The longer the detention, the more remote, the more harmful is what the research shows. And as we traced people through the system, we heard the despair in their experiences, their decisions to go on hunger strikes or attempt self-harm. And all of this calls to mind some of Judith Butler's writing, where she asks whose life counts as human, whose lives count as lives, and finally, what makes for a grievable life. So we see externalization and detention being used as deterrence, but of course deterrence fails because people keep coming. So it fails in at least two ways. People still embark to seek asylum, and the deterrence policies increase their precarity and the violence against them. And yet these policies continue to move around the globe. And I've told you some of their paths already, from the US into the Caribbean to Pacific Islands, Australia's importation, and I'll just tell you a couple of more places where they're traveling, specifically to Denmark, where in 2018, Denmark unveiled a plan to use a small island, Lindholm, 80 kilometers from Copenhagen, to build a detention facility to house people seeking asylum. The plans were eventually scrapped, but you can see other countries now adapting Australian policies. Canada has done this, not with detention, but with some of the policies. And the UK, of course, has floated many different plans to detain people, including a plan in 2020 to put people potentially on Ascension Island and St. Helena. Most recently, what was signed was the UK-Rwanda deal, the idea of sending asylum seekers some 4,000 miles away to be detained in Rwanda. In Bangladesh, the Bangladeshi government has built a silt island, Bazan Char, very controversial because of its location in the paths of monsoons and cyclones, and the concern that there aren't effective plans to remove people quickly in the event of a storm. But this has been built with a capacity to house 100,000 people, And the government has already been moving Rohingya refugees from Cox's Bazar by boat to Bazan Char. There are approximately 30,000 or so in detention there now. So these policies are on the move. And I think the term char is a really significant and interesting one. It refers to a particular form of part land, part water, along river embankments that disappear and reemerge with the tides. And this was a form that was used during British colonial rule of India, where build-up along the embankments eventually became more permanent spaces of residence for marginal people to live. And so char becomes a metaphor to think through the infrastructure that begins as temporary surrounding the death of asylum, but becomes more permanent. And the last part of my talk is to ask about what we're left with in the afterlife of asylum as protection recedes, what is lost and what remains in the afterlife. What are we left with, and what might we search for in its wake? When asylum is no longer accessible, but we live with these vast infrastructures that I've just begun to show you. And I'm really interested in what happens when detention facilities shut down, when people who were detained there are released and people who worked there are no longer working there. What happens? And this is the basis of a new project that I'm doing, just starting now, called Asylum's Afterlives. And some of the places that I'm looking to as the afterlives of asylum are detention and island detention, and also what feminist political geographers call intimate geopolitics, or the lived experiences of people who were in detention and then experienced a departure of some kind. And also for islanders who were involved in detention, what happens after that industry leaves the island and shuts down. And one of the places where people are being resettled is in geopolitical deals. Probably one of the biggest ones is the Turkey-EU deal. But there are all of these arrangements being made between countries to stop people from entering or to return people. And there's a growing literature on these deals. They're still premised on the logic of deterrence, to kind of strip people seeking asylum of the agency to choose a place to go, to stop them from having that choice. The deals have been heavily criticized by human rights groups, but I want to tell you about one related to these island detention facilities. And that is, in 2016, there was a Supreme Court decision on PNG that found the detention on Manus Island was illegal and it had to close down. But there were several hundred people who were found to be refugees who were left in limbo on the island. And in his final months in office, President Barack Obama signed one of these deals with then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull of Australia, wherein the US would resettle up to 1,200 refugees from Manus and Nauru. And in exchange, Australia would settle 30 to 40 asylees from the United States. This wasn't the first time that the US and Australia have signed a deal like this. And they tend to send asylees who have arrived from places like Haiti or Central America to Australia. Now, Trump, very famously, when he came into office, called this a dumb deal and hung up on a call with the Prime Minister about it. But quietly, his administration honored the deal and resettled people during the pandemic when they were otherwise shutting down refugee resettlement and much immigration. And there's a similar kind of experimental policy happening in Canada that's led by people, and I thank Godfrey for introducing the idea that Canadians are somewhat involved in resettlement as part of civil society. There's a private sponsorship program where groups of 5 Canadians or permanent residents can get together and amass resources to work with the government to resettle people. And there's a group being led by Australian immigrants in Canada and the United States who are working to resettle people from the islands using the private sponsorship program, premised on the idea, similar to how we're talking about islands as relational, that people too are relational and not isolated islands. And they're trying to address what they see as the wrongs of the Australian government. And I see this movement as part of a lot of abolition movements, a lot of anti-detention and deportation movements that are countering the death of asylum with the life of activism, which involves locating what's happening, memorializing deaths, visiting people in detention, all premised on a politics of location, starting where people are. For example, this is a photograph from Lampedusa, the small Italian island, which is part of Sicily and close to Tunisia, where young activists were collecting personal effects from the boat cemetery, pictured on the right, in order to remember people who had passed through the island by creating a small museum on their island dedicated to migration and its passage through the island. I want to end my talk in conversation with Behrouz Boochani. Some of you may know his very famous memoir, No Friend But the Mountains. This is a still from a film that he made called Choka, Please Tell Us the Time, with Iranian filmmaker Arash Sarvastani in 2017. Behrouz is a Kurdish-Iranian journalist and writer who fled persecution in support of Kurdish independence. He ended up passing through Indonesia and twice boarded boats to try to get to Australia to make a claim for asylum. Both times his boats either broke down, and the second one actually went down, but he was rescued and then imprisoned on Christmas Island and eventually flown to Manus Island, where he was detained for over 6 years. He says in his memoir, "They passed me from island to island like a criminal." In his memoir, No Friend But the Mountains, he really captures both the dehumanization of people who are being held in detention, as well as the exploitation of islanders. And he writes about how when they were being flown from Christmas Island to Manus Island, they were told that islanders were savage, that they were cannibals, that they should watch out for themselves. While he was in prison, Behrouz used a cell phone clandestinely to record and send tens of thousands of written texts and video clips to his collaborators in other countries, which is how he wrote his award-winning memoir and also how they made this film, which exposes what was happening in the facility. Choka is the name of an isolation unit where people are segregated from the rest of the prison on Manus and tortured and subjected to extreme forms of deprivation, often to scare them into not talking about abuses that they've seen, for example. Behrouz was detained in Choka twice. And Choka is antagonistically named after the native bird of Manus, Choka, known for its morning call and the pride of Manusians. And in the film, Manusians are very distressed to learn that this bird, which is their national pride, is being used and abused as a name for what's happening to people who have, after all, arrived in search of care and are being detained on the island. Behrouz's time in Manus prison informs something that he and his interpreter and collaborator, Omid Tofigian, write about as Manus prison theory. So they use the architecture and the intimate inner workings of the prison to come up with an intellectual and political project, as they call it, a call to invite people in to confront forms of border violence. Quoting them, they say, border violence is rooted in coloniality, part of the same colonial thinking that continues displacement, dispossession, and repression of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so I think there are incredible social movements and creative projects that are arising from within island detention centers, such as this film and book, that offer opportunities to challenge the intentional isolation and constructed remoteness of island detention facilities and the punishment of people within them. And I find great inspiration in this project and in this work, which invites us into solidarity across borders, invites us to imagine alternative futures as we understand islands as relational places. And so to conclude, this is my last slide. I've talked to you about externalization, its history, how it's moved across space and time, from region to region, from practice into policy. I've talked about historical moments of racial formation that happen in this process, that become exclusions, that make their way into legislative changes, where rights are curtailed, where exclusion is normalized, and we see the death of asylum. Islands have been central to this death of asylum. As governments retreat from resettlement and asylum, these ad hoc trades, the geopolitical deals that I told you about, begin to stand in for more sustainable solutions for people in search of protection. So asylum's afterlives are still unfolding, and I think the role of islands remains an open question, and that there's much to be learned and to join in the important social movements that are arising from these sites. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Alison. That was wonderful. Really appreciate the talk. So we have about 15 minutes for some questions, and do we have another microphone too in the back? Okay, thank you. So yeah, we'll open it up for questions. Godfrey.
Well done, Alison. Really fascinating. You managed to put in a lot of stuff as you promised us you would do. Perhaps we can extend the discussion to consider the great irony in the context of migration, because while we see all these states taking extraordinary steps to prevent people from moving into their jurisdictions, at the same time, certainly in Western Europe, the population is shrinking, we need labor, and the people who are needed to work to maintain those economies are begging to come in. So how do we reconcile that there's this huge push against foreigners, huge xenophobia, right-wing parties, etc., capitalizing on this sentiment and so on, when the economies of those very same countries actually need those people to survive?
I agree. It's a very important point. Thank you for the question, Godfrey. I think one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to Behrouz Bouchani's and others' work that is premised on the idea of storytelling and sharing people's journeys and lives is because ultimately, you're right, there are various ways that we can come at the challenges of migration policy, asylum and refugee resettlement policy. But there is this desire to, again, separate and segregate streams of migration, this obsession with separating people out, finding ways to manage them, to use the language of migration management. When in fact, if we had a more human-centered approach, and here, Sasha, I'm thinking of your talk yesterday, and the idea of, what does a human-centered, island-centered, community-centered security strategy look like? I think a human-centered way of responding to people's need to migrate would be a very different one that could potentially reconcile exactly what you're talking about. On the one hand, the desire or the economic need of countries to build their populations, and the other hand, this incredible and contradictory investment in very harmful policies that keep people away from precisely that, immigration.
Next question. Oh, yes, in the back. Sorry.
Thank you. My question is about the economics of confinement, organizing places like Guantanamo Bay. Christmas Island looked expensive as well. How does the means ever justify that cost even?
I mentioned that there's so much political support for what are very expensive border enforcement and detention policies. But again, when we shift perspective, it does defy logic. So you mentioned Christmas Island. I said just the construction of that facility cost over $400 million Australian. But its maintenance is also incredibly expensive. Everything needs to be flown to the island. Food, all kinds of workers that enter into short-term contracts. Also, there's not a lot of medical care on the island. So, for example, pregnant women on the island, both islanders and also people who are in detention, if they're pregnant, every time they see a doctor and when it's time to give birth, they're flown several hours to Perth, Australia, for medical care. And that's happened actually a lot from all of the islands where refugees have been brought to Australia for medical care and then returned to the islands, which is a source of, you can imagine, much controversy and legal challenge, that people will be seen as okay to bring them to the mainland territory for medical care, but then returned to the detention facilities on the islands that are harmful to their physical well-being. So much of it really defies logic. So when you start to ask perfectly normal questions about the economics of it, it starts to make less and less sense because it's so extraordinarily expensive and also harmful. Another place I thought maybe you were going with that question is, how are these facilities funded? And that relates to people who are out there who are tracking the money. Often they're through development projects and budget lines. So Australia will fund particular forms of development on the island, and this becomes one of them, a form of economic development in the form of constructing a detention facility.
I think another question in the back.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask if you could maybe share a little bit more about, I was struck by the way you were talking about the haunting and the afterlife of asylum and the necropolitical aspect of how these systems and processes, which are meant to support and provide refuge, right, have been shifted. And then this, note that you ended on about possibilities of alternative imaginings or futures and how we make that kind of switch or how you juxtapose those kind of processes or kind of relate them. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about, how you're working on that or thinking through some of that. But thanks so much.
Thank you for the questions. I appreciate that you asked about the Afterlives because I discussed it rather quickly. But I think, so the project that I'm starting now is going to be doing oral histories with people who are being resettled through these two experimental policies that I mentioned in North America, very different ones in the US and in Canada. But I'm very interested just to understand how people reflect on and make sense of these remarkable journeys that they have taken around the globe, many of them perhaps originally displaced by US forms of war-making abroad, only to find themselves, when they tried to reach Australia, detained on an island where they were in limbo for a long period of time, and then traded by Australia to the very country that may well have been part of their displacement in the first place. Any part of that journey is so challenging. The accounts of people's, the trauma of traveling by boat, the periods of limbo, the time in detention, the stress and trauma of uncertainty. And then, of course, the experience of being resettled and starting a new life in a new society. And so I am very eager, just as I learned so much from how Beirut himself makes sense of his time in detention. And I should say, if you don't know, he was eventually resettled he found asylum in New Zealand. New Zealand having offered resettlement to many of the people during the original Pacific solution, as well as what's often called the third country that offers resettlement. So I'm so eager to learn how people narrate and make sense of these very intimate geopolitical journeys, the lives that they're living. I've also begun oral histories with the people, particularly the Australians who are leading that resettlement through the use of the private sponsorship program in Canada, to understand their perspective, their connection as Australian immigrants in North America to the displacement and resettlement of people from the islands. And I think one of the things that we don't think or talk about enough is what this violence that is unfolding today on so many people will mean for them and for their families across generations. how these experiences will haunt across time and space. And that's one of the reasons why I engage scholarship on haunting and the idea that there are important histories and contemporary practices of oppression happening that have not been dealt with and that we need to talk about. And in a way, I gave those examples of the oral histories. Eventually, the plan is also to go to the islands and do oral histories with people who worked in the facilities, to also understand their experience of island detention and the detention industry on the island and what comes after. And I think this relates to your second question about potential solidarities and alternatives, because I think what's so important about Behruz's writing is that, he was subjected to this very harmful system for several years. He witnessed so much violence between both the Australians and also Manusians who were running the facility, and yet he sees the exploitation of all of these people in the facility as a shared experience and one that we need to understand relationally. And that leads to Monist prison theory as a call for all peoples in all places to join these cross-border solidarities and movements. And so I think there's so much political potential to think through what are the alternatives to what we're seeing here? What are the alternatives to investing so heavily in harmful, exclusionary, violent policies? And that's what I see activism doing, abolition activism, anti-deportation activism, figuring out how greater and greater numbers of people and movements can join together to gain momentum, to contest these policies and practices. Thanks.
Great. So we have one question from somebody who's watching online that I'd like to share here. It says, Kia ora, Alison. Polly Stupples here from Victoria University, New Zealand. Thanks so much for your work, which I use regularly in my classes. I'd appreciate your thoughts on the recent move by New Zealand's Labour to propose to detain asylum seekers by sea for up to 28 days, despite no boats of refugees ever having reached New Zealand directly.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thanks for watching online. I don't know where the video is, but hi. It's another example. And I would say here there's a parallel maybe between New Zealand and Canada, because Canada also receives very few people arriving by boat. I mean, it's something like 6 boats over the last 30 plus years. And yet each time there has been a boat arrival, Canada has changed its refugee claimant policies and laws in relation to those arrivals. In other words, they've been incredibly catalyzing, politicizing moments where more punitive measures are put in place to punish people traveling by boat, traveling in greater numbers, traveling with the use of smugglers, punishments against smugglers, enhancing the criteria to detain people, building up detention. And when I first started doing research on remote detention, it was actually when I was a PhD student in Canada now 20 plus years ago, and I was doing research on the Canadian response to some of these boats arriving, actually from Fujian, China, and intercepted off the west coast of British Columbia. And what I did was an ethnography of what was then the Department of Citizenship and Immigration Canada. So I went into the bureaucracy, into the offices every day to study how people were responding to boat migration. The premise being that their response to those asylum claims were very different from their responses to all the other asylum claims that were happening on a daily basis with people coming across the land border or coming through the airport. In other words, that politicization, the visibility of those boat arrivals had real material effects and consequences for people's chances of asylum. And so I got kind of an inside look at what the Canadian government was doing in its response and what they were exploring as possibilities. And this is a long way of getting to your question, which is to say they also looked into renting large boats to use for detention at sea. And I know this has been happening. Italy has done this, Malta as well, Greece. So again, it's sort of that proliferation that I was talking about of spaces of confinement, using the boat itself as a detention facility. Sharon Pickering, the criminologist I mentioned in Australia, has written about this, carceral spaces on boats at sea. And it's also consistent with immigration legislation more broadly, which has the capacity to turn all kinds of geographical locations into legal sites of detention. So that, for example, in the United States, if someone is in the custody of an immigration officer in a hospital, legally that hospital room becomes a site of detention, or in a school, or wherever. So again, it's the confluence of geography and law, the remarkable power of the law to remake geography, to turn spaces into carceral geographies. And I think it's the example you give in New Zealand is also like, it's an absurd one, because why when there are no boats arriving? But it just shows you also, I think, the contagion of these practices. And of course, countries are studying each other's best practices. Canada, at that time that I was doing that research, sent teams of people to Australia to study detention, to the United States to study boarding boats at sea and interception practices, to the EU to study legal prosecution of smugglers. So they're always sharing practices, and there's a global politics at work here that enables some of these policies to be adopted, even if they don't make much rational, logical sense in a local or national context, or global for that matter.
Great. So thank you very much, everybody, for those questions, but thank you very much, Dr. Mountz, for a really great talk. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we have a short 10-minute break, and then after that, back in this room here, we have Moritake Tomikawa will be doing the next keynote presentation in 10 minutes.
40分からでしたっけ40分からでよかったですね。山崎先生、操作始めていいですかね。山崎先生。つけていいですかね。入ってますね。入ってますかね。OK。入ってますね。聞こえますね。OK。OK。大丈夫ですか、富川先生。大丈夫ですか。自分が呼ぶんで大丈夫ですよ。Yeah. Okay, I hope you all had a good 10-minute break. So it's time for our second keynote speech. So our second keynote speaker is Professor Moritake Tomikawa. He's Okinawa International University Professor Emeritus and served as President of Okinawa International University from 2008 to 2012. And he was also a Vice Governor of Okinawa Prefecture from 2017 to 2021. He obtained BA from University of the Ryukyus in 1971 and MA and PhD from Meiji University in 1974 and 2001 respectively. As an expert in island economies, Okinawa studies and Taiwan studies, his extensive works include Okinawa development and soft power, Asia dynamism and Okinawa development, and also many other publications in these fields. As Vice Governor of Okinawa Prefecture, he was deeply involved in formulating the new 21st century Okinawa promotion plan that is a guiding principle of Okinawa's development. So in today's lecture, he will be talking more about the Okinawa development plan. Lecture title is Changes and Future Prospects of Okinawa Economy, Development Strategy of Island Economy. Please join me in giving Professor Moritake
Thank you very much for introducing. It is my honor and pleasure to be here and to talk about the case of Okinawa and island development strategy. And I appreciate your interest in the Okinawa issue. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much to the conference staff and especially Professor Yamazaki, who supported my presentation. There are a chapter of my paper. Before starting my presentation, I'd like to explain some points my paper address. First of all, Okinawa economy had been on a low level due to this disadvantage of an island economy. However, paradigm shift happened recently, so that Okinawa come to have the potential to lead the Japanese economy this direction. Okinawa economy is activating now, activating business and absorbing the Asian economic dynamism. Not only inbound tourists visiting, but also foreign investment inflow to the Okinawa are growing mostly reflected in the construction of world-famous hotels. We should not overlook the fact that just before COVID-19, Okinawa economically outperformed the entire Japan. According to economic data such as Bank Japan Tankan Survey, GDP growth ratio and unemployment ratio, these economic performances have never seen before. why Okinawa surplus Japanese economic performances and contribute to Japanese economic revival? The reason is Okinawa has comparative advantages such as bridgehead in East Asia, soft power, population growth, and well-being in the vast sea area. The new Okinawa promotion plan, considered as a post-COVID-19 situation, its goals aim to the island where people can feel safe, secure, and happy. Okinawa has a diversity and flexibility that it can adapt to and accommodate the change of era. I'd like to introduce Okinawa an example of how island can achieve the strong economic development. Okinawa Prefecture is in a westernmost region of Japan, stretching the southern tip of the ocean-shaped Japanese island chain. The prefecture comprises of 160 small and huge islands, 47 of which are inhabited. Dotting a vast sea and expanding roughly 1,000 kilometers from the east to west, and approximately 400 kilometers from north to south. Within a radius of 1,500 kilometers from Okinawa, Seoul, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Manila are included. The entire Okinawa prefecture is in a subtropical zone, blessed with temperate weather through the year. The blue sea enveloping the island is a treasure chest of life when tropical fish, and coral reef and other creatures thrive. Okinawa Prefecture, once an independent state as a Ryukyu Kingdom, prospered with trade with China and other neighbor countries. The 1609 Satsuma invasion brought to Ryukyu Kingdom into the fold of Japan feudal system. In 1879, the Ryukyu Kingdom became a prefecture of Japan when a feudal domain are abolished. In 1954, Okinawa Prefecture became a site of Japan's most feared land battle during the Pacific War. And many precious lives were lost. After the war, Okinawa was placed under the United States military administration and finally returned to Japan in 1972. Okinawa leverages soft power to create a sustainable global choice tourist destination for its leading industry, which drives the local economy. Grounded in the principle of providing a safe, secure, and comfortable tourist destination, Okinawa Prefecture worked to create an attractive tourist destination and enhancing an Okinawan tourism brand. The right side figure shows a number of the tourists in Okinawa. Before COVID-19, it was over 10 million, and tourism revenue was about 50 billion Japanese yen. Then it, as you know, drastically decreased due to COVID-19. However, now it's recovering. let's take an economic development process in Okinawa based on Okinawa Promotion Plan, which is a 10 years plan and the guidance principle for development. It started with an 1972 diversion to Japan based on the Act Special Measure for Promotion and Development of Okinawa. Since then, there has been Okinawa Promotion Plan 10 years, and we are now in Plan 6. The plan is applied to Okinawa due to following reasons. There are 4 special situations to be considered for Okinawa. Historical situation. Okinawa was under the U.S. administration authority over 26 years. Geographical situation. Okinawa is comprised of many islands in huge sea area, and they are remote from the mainland Japan. National situation. Okinawa is in a subtropical zone, unlike the rest of Japan. Social situation. U.S. military base and facility are too much concentrated. The plan was conducted to improve this special situation. The target of Plan 1 through Plan 4 were following. Correcting economic and social disparity between Okinawa and mainland Japan, building up on a foundation of self-reliance economy, establishing a peace and comfort life and dynamic market economies. Let's take a look at an achievement of ratio of this Okinawa promotion plan. Population growth achieved in target in each plan. The number of employees and labor force population reached to the goal in one of the plans. The important thing is the target of GDP and per capita income have never been achieved in any plan. Let's examine the effect of a plan viewpoint of correcting unequal development of regional economy and improvement of foundation for self-reliance economy. Regarding the farmer, after reversion to Japan, improved infrastructure as a road, river, port, and harbor, airport, medical facility, etc., because of a high rate subsidized from the national government. However, there are significant differences in areas such as income, employment, and university advancement ratio. A self-reliance economy can be defined by the development of economic muscle or regional physical strength. That means growth through technological development. Let's take a production change from 1975 through 2000 by input-output table analysis to see the technological improvement. The chart shows as a few positive values in mining metal product. However, most of industrial category shows a large negative value, especially tertiary industry, all of tertiary industry. There was a little technological development during that period. We can say that improvement of foundation of self-reliance economy is Okinawa is not achieved. This shows a technological development from the 2005 and 2018 15, but the basic picture remains the same, except personal services are getting higher. Even now, lack of technological development has not changed. The World Bank report, the East Asian Miracle 1996, pointed out high economic ratio started in Asian country in 1970s. Since then, the growth has penetrated Asian country, mainly China. The growth trend seems to overlap in Asian country as the flying geese theory indicates. The center of gravity of world economy has shifted to Asia through economic dynamism. On the other hand, the population of Japan has been decreased since 2008, and Japan faced an economic stagnation called lost 20 years. So Japan has been lowering its economic presence in the world. Its domestic market have been decreasing. The momentum for business and capital to get out from Japan has become bigger and bigger. Running a business in Japan is impossible without considering about the Asian market scale. If Okinawa can play the role of bridgehead in Asia, the scenario would be that Okinawa could put up the Japanese decreasing economic power. This is a paradigm shift for Okinawa. A general government promoting the policy that Okinawa can become a model of economic growth in the 21st century as a front runner in the Japanese economy. Okinawa is expected to business world to become a driving force of revitalize the Japanese economy. The Okinawa promotion policy scenario, Okinawa promotion policy specified Okinawa economic ability in a following field: promotion of the tourism industry, promotion of the IT industry, establishment of an international logistic hub, establishment of international science and technology base. We should not overlook that just before COVID-19, Okinawa outperformed the entire Japan according to economic data such as Bank of Japan Tankan survey, GDP growth ratio, and unemployment ratio. The economic engine started. These economic phenomena have never seen before. According to Nichigen Tankan, this is a short-term economic survey of principal enterprise in Japan. The Okinawa's business situation was worse than in Japan before 2010. However, Okinawa outperformed the entire Japan thereafter. This red line graph is Okinawa. This is entire Japan. And after COVID-19, both Okinawa and Japan economic collapse. We have to pay attention. However, we have to pay attention to the recovery stages. Okinawa outperformed entire Japan again over here. Okinawa's unemployment ratio has been higher than Japan at one time. Okinawa was almost 3 times worse than entire Japan. It has become changing for Okinawa for many years. Before COVID-19, for about 10 years, Okinawa unemployment ratio improved and gradually become closer to 2%, the same as entire Japan. Okinawa's GDP was weak in the past. However, Okinawa growth ratio has been outperformed the entire Japan since 2008. Okinawa's average growth ratio was 1.66% from 2007 through 2018. Entire Japan was 0.32%. We should not overlook that just before COVID-19, Okinawa outperformed the entire Japan in economic indicators such as the Bank of Japan Tankan Survey, GDP growth ratio, and unemployment ratio. The market recognized Okinawa's economy potential. A company relocate and facility opening for luxury hotels, theme park, and amusement business and underway. The amount of loan and price land of Okinawa is climbing up higher than in mainland Japan. We also see the commercial and new urban development on the site returned from the U.S. military base. Depending on U.S. military economy is a hint at the development of Okinawa because the military base are not economic sector, such as a farm or household based on market mechanism. So it does not have the nature of economic activity, nor bring about the macroeconomic growth and multiplication. The U.S. military expenditure ratio to the Okinawa GDP was 86% in 1958. However, it has decreased gradually, and now it is about 5%. Dependence on military economy has limitation on development. U.S. military base has frozen development potential long time. However, the site returned to land road, it becomes the growth hub or economic development due to socio-environmental exchange. Successful example of urban development can be seen in a site of a U.S. military base returned, such as Mihama in Chatham, city center in Naha, this is center Naha. Daikam Ion Mall in Kitanakagusuku. The site returned from U.S. military base were empty land first. So we could draw an ideal plan. Urban land use plans can be designed for public park lot, beaches, stadium, commercial facilities, and hotels. Most of returned sites have good traffic condition, so commercial facilities tend to be located on such a site. Although land prices gradually go down in mainland Japan, they go up in Okinawa. This red line graph is in Okinawa. This is entire Japan. Although the land price gradually So, how could Okinawa surpass the entire Japan in economic performances and contribute to Japanese economic revival? The reason is Okinawa has the following comparative advantages. Bridgehead in East Asia, soft power, population growth, place of well-being, vast sea area. I'll explain it sequentially. Okinawa is adjacent to the Asian Pacific region and centrally located in Asia. This is a geographical comparative advantages. Okinawa Prefecture promoted the Okinawa Asian economic strategy to absorb Asian dynamism and build up Okinawa economy. The strategy is the following: promotion of international logistic hub, promotion of world-class tourist resort, promotion of an aviation-related industrial cluster, formation of a smart hub that creates a global information and telecommunication base leading Asia, promotion of a new manufacturing industry connecting to Asia. The soft power has great potential in current economy. The word soft power was originally used by Professor Joseph Samuel Nye, Jr. for international politics. It means the attractiveness of state power emerging from the nature, culture, and non-military policy. Nowadays, the concept has been broadly defined and frequently used, especially for economic development. Here we define soft power as an attractiveness by nature, culture, and history. Komiyama's theory is very important when we think about an economic revival and development. There was a project team called Innovation Japan, whose chairman was then Tokyo University professor Hiroshi Komiyama. The national government concentrated with a team about how Japanese economy could revive from the lost 20 years completely. According to the project report, the trump card of Japanese economic revival was very clear. It is important that companies should respond to the high dimensional needs. They are the world-best longevity, safety and security, comfortable environment, and education standards. This is a theory of Japan could revive from the lost 20 years. I think that Okinawa has potential to meet such high dimensional needs. The population of Japan has decreased since 2008. And especially in rural area, rapid decrease in underway. It is called regional extinction because a function of community in such area will extinct in the near future. Okinawa is exceptional prefecture of Japan, where its population has increased. Okinawa is expected to supply human resources and scale up the market. There is no generation definition of well-being, but WHO's Geneva chapter for well-being was endorsed in 2021. It outlined for key action as design an equitable economy that serves human development within planetary boundaries. Create a public policy for common goods, achieve universal health coverage, address digital transformation, counteract human and its empowerment, and to strengthen the beneficial value and preserve the planet. According to the OECD report, Building Back Better, a Sustainable Resilient Recovery After COVID-19, published on June 2020, was not only conservative treatment, but radical response is necessary to achieve a resilient recovery. The Building Back Better is seeking the well-being as follows: a circle of centers well-being, inclusiveness, aligned with net zero greenhouse gas emission, strengthen the climate resilience, leading biodiversity loss, innovation building on behavior changes, improving such supply chain, religious and circulation. The concept is based on a new Okinawa promotion plan. Well-being is interrupt to mean that an island people can enjoy a happy, safe, secure, and active life, so that no one is left behind on this plan. Sorry, it's written in Japanese. This is a target. Okinawa has a huge sea area and diverse ocean resources that bring about an economic development. In the new Okinawa promotion plan, the marine industry is listed as a leading industry for next generation. With this background in mind, Okinawa Prefecture showed a basic direction which promotes the location of new industry utilizing marine resources. Okinawa has a high potential to develop the blue economy. Blue economy can be developed in a society where people can sustain and enjoy their life through nature conservation. It aims for sustainable development that generates industry and employment through effective utilization and nature conservation of ocean and island conservation. It is intended to the fishery, marine transport, tourism, and energy and environmental use. Finally, I'd like to summarize my point. As I told you, Okinawa has been at low economic level. However, business has become active since around 2010. The market recognized the potential of Okinawa and expected that Okinawa will pull up the Japanese economy. I have never seen Okinawa surpass mainland Japan in Okinawa in economic indexes. This is a paradigm shift for Okinawa. There are comparative advantages for Okinawa: a bridgehead of Asia, a soft power, growing population, a place of well-being, and a beneficiary of a vast sea area. Okinawa promotion plan is a guiding principle for future and aim to well-being. Its objectives can be realized through sustainable development based on human being. Okay, thank you for listening. That's all.
Thank you so much, Professor Tomikawa. So we have time for questions. And for those who are online, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. We will also have time to take questions from online audience. But first, we can take questions from the in-person audience.
I'm sorry, my English is not strong, so that's why I'll ask an interpretation in question time.
Good morning. I'm Joffy Santarita from the University of the Philippines. You're talking about the vast sea characteristic of Okinawa. So I'm just curious about the attempt of the Okinawa to definitely develop the ocean renewable energy, meaning to say that it could be from tidal or undercurrents and waves to generate sources of energy from these sources, which is actually abundant in Okinawa area. Thank you.
この海の資源の活用でこの使用再現このリニューアブルエナジーの再使用できるようなこの沖縄の取り組みっていうのはどういうものがありますかっていう。
実は沖縄県では、海洋立憲というプロジェクトを進めていまして、単に資源の開発だけでなくて、さっき言ったような自然と調和した開発というものを今プランだけでやっていますけど、さっき話した新しい沖縄振興計画の中ではそれ実現するようなアクションを起こすことになっております。
このプロジェクトの中に組み込まれていく。There's a project that some groups in Okinawa are also working on to facilitate the use of renewable energies, particularly in the oceanic environment. And this new 21st Century Development Plan also includes some of the projects to use the renewable energies. なんかこの具体的なものとかっていうのはあったりするんですか？
プランそのものは計画はあります。ただ実際に実行を移すまでには予算とかつけなきゃいけませんので、それは今新しく走っている新沖縄振興計画の中で予算をつけながら実現していくという方向になっています。プランはあります。
So there's a plan for that, but now they're working on the financial aspect to realize the project. But yeah, the renewable resources, the use of it is a big part of the new plan, the development plan.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Just one question. You spoke about when the U.S. handed over the base, that this became an opportunity for building a new development that has been so key to the development of Okinawa. And I just wonder, I know in a lot of cases of base abandonment, there are issues of environmental impacts, groundwater pollution, all kinds of residue from the previous military activity. And I just wonder if those were challenges and how Okinawa dealt with them.
このベース基地の返還の後にどのようなこの問題というかこの環境問題だったりっていうのはどういうものがあったりして、その沖縄はどういう対処しているんですかっていうことですね。
基本的には日本の法律で返還地のいろんな有害物質とかそういうものを取り除くことになっています。しかしその法律から漏れてくる現象が起こってきています。それに対してはまたいろいろ対応に今県もやってますけど、なかなか難しい問題があります。一番難しいのは不発弾。これは新しく住宅建設するときに機器で掘っていると突然ボーンといったりするので、 それは国も金を出してやっていますけど、そういったなかなか全部カバーできない問題はあります。
So in terms of the environment issues associated with the bases, there's Japanese law that basically asks the U.S. militaries 基地がこのアメリカ軍が環境の対処してるんですか、それとも日本が。
これ日本がです。
So there's a Japanese law that basically deal with the environmental issues after the bases. So there is a kind of the law that the Japanese government needs to clean up some of the environmental issues after that. But there's some issues that are not covered by the law. So that's something that the Okinawa government is still need to work on. And there's another problem with the unexploded ordinances under the ground. So after the base was returned, when the Okinawa government tried to build something and dig up the ground, there's some instances of the unexploded ordinances with some explosion of the ordinances. So there are some issues that are not covered by the law, and that's something that Okinawa government needs to deal with.
Thank you for your talk. So I had a question about GDP growth per capita. So you mentioned that Okinawa as a prefecture, the economy is growing more than other prefectures in Japan, but you also mentioned that population is increasing. So once you account for that population increase, is the actual living standard of Okinawans increasing, or is it kind of balancing out?
この GDP のところでこのポピュレーションの人口の増加があったじゃないですか、その GDP の増加もあったんですけど、この人口の増加もあって、こういう関係性というのはどういうものですか。
GDP が増加して一番大きな原因は観光収入です。インバウンド、トゥーリストで、それがかなり大きく広げていってますけど、沖縄の経済の構造は先ほど示したように技術進歩ではなかなか発展してないんですが、ファイナルディマンド、観光とかそういうものに引っ張られてやってます。それはもう沖縄以外のこのアジアとかのダイナミズムがあって伸びていますので、次のステップは最終需要が引っ張っている沖縄経済をその技術進歩による経済に転化しなきゃいけないということです。今の現在のこの活況は多分に観光収入です。
So the economy of Okinawa is still dependent on tourism, so the external resources. So while the population increases, still the economy of Okinawa depends on the tourism. So the goal and challenges for the Okinawa is to shift from tourism-dependent economy to more the economy that, based on skills and human resources of Okinawans.
Actually, there's a question about the balance between population increase and the population GDP. So his question is about population increase may decrease the growth of economy.
Right. この人口増加とともにこの GDP もあったと思うんですけど、この人口増加があるために。そうですかね。人口増加とともに。
人口増加による県民生活の向上というのは多分に企業、どっちかというとサービス業とかそういう人手を使うような建築業とか、それたくさん入ってきまして、沖縄の失業率がかなり低下して、それが、ある意味で庶民の生活の所得のアップにつながっているということはあると思います。ただこれまだ検証していませんけど、多分に推測ですけど、そういうことが考えられます。
人口増加と GDP の増加は生活水準の向上にはつながっている。
There is a relationship, I think. Yeah.
So to that, so yeah, just to clarify, to answer your question, I think that the relationship between the population increase and the GDP increase kind of corresponds in the sense that a GDP increases, the more the job opportunities also produced for the population of Okinawa. And in that sense, the living conditions for Okinawans also improve as they have more job opportunities.
No question from the online.
Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I learned a lot. And I wanted to ask again about what you said when the U.S. military base is returned and the structures are all gone. Is that also part of a requirement when the base is returned that the structures are like what happened to the structures? Who took them down?
このベースは基地が返還された後のこの建物とかっていうのはどうなるんですかね。この建物の取り壊しっていうのもそういう返還のこの一つの中に入られてるんですかね。この基地の建物インフラストラクチャーとか。返還された地域は基本的には土地区画整理法という法律でそういう土地計画をしていきます。でさっき話したように沖縄基地がたくさん占めてますから、これが縮小するといろんな商業施設とかそういうのがたくさん入り込んできて、沖縄で最も活性化している地域はほとんどが基地跡地領なんですね。そこがさっき言った基地はいろんな解釈があるけど、経済から解釈すると沖縄の発展をフリーズしてきたというふうに考えられます。それが今外れてきている。この建物を壊すのは誰の責任？更地にする。これは全部現状回復といいまして、元の土地に全部やらなきゃいけない。壊してあとは、いや、これ日本政府がお金してもらってます。So the Japanese government provides some finance resources to, tear down all the buildings, but the U.S. government, U.S. military is not responsible for that, even after they return the bases.
Very few people may know that the Japanese government actually pays for the American troops to be stationed in Japan. You had a comment on your slide early, Professor, where you started off with what seemed like a fact that because we are dealing with islands, islands have an economic disadvantage. I think that's what you had on your first slide. I would disagree with that.
このスライドの方でアイランド、島はこのディスアドバンテージがあったんですけど、賛成しないみたいで、もっと聞いた方がいいですかね。どのようなことが、もっとどのようなことが。Mostly about narrow market and few resources in an island.
But that's about size, not about islandness. And Okinawa is not small. Right? Okinawa has a population of 2 million people. I wouldn't consider that to be a small island. It's an island, yes.
Yeah.
So the problem in that case is not islandness, it's smallness. It's a question of scale, not a question of geography.
必ずしも島が悪いというわけではないという話です。
この島は小ささだけ、地理じゃなくて、この位置関係とかの。
それは先生がおっしゃる通りだと思います。特に最近高級ホテルとか観光客が行くところは、昔は観光客来なかった宮古島とか小さな島にたくさん行っていまして、その小さな島の魅力が今マーケットで認められてきていると思います。
So he's saying that still Okinawa has some characteristics that attract people, particularly tourists, such as Miyako and other islands, that can be a great place for to generate more economic opportunities for Okinawa. So in that sense, Okinawa as an archipelago and island place has great characteristics and potentials for future development.
Mm. はいはい。あ、なるほど。島の大きさじゃなくて、ポテンシャルが抑えられているんじゃないかということに対して先生はどうお考えかということですか。ポテンシャルが抑えられているというのはかなりの部分、例えば私が住んでる北谷町では 60% 近く米軍基地があるわけですね。となると、ここに産業が出るとか、住居を構えるとかなかなかできなくて、そういう意味ではその発展を阻害していると思うんですね。あるいはその交通要件が真ん中から通れない。今その鉄軌道というのを議論してますけど、全部米軍基地があってそこを突き抜けるわけにはいかないとか、そういういろんな問題がありまして、米軍基地がだんだん縮小すると今はチャンスが出てくると。以前はですね、米軍基地から来る収入が多かったためにどっちかというとその小さくしなくてもいいという議論が、今全くそういう議論はないです。もう返してもらった方が地主さんにとっても、それからマクロエコノミカルにも発展するということが、私が言った通りペーパーに書いたことです。
So I think his argument is that Okinawa is not small, but the challenges for Okinawa is that still Okinawa has the military bases and the land that Okinawa cannot use because of that. For the future of Okinawa, having more land and removing the military bases can be a great step forward toward the further development of Okinawa. And I think that's what he was saying with the slide.
Thank you very much for your talk. I learned a lot from it. I just had a question. If I read that the poverty rate in Okinawa is higher than Japan, so how does that account? How does the growth of Okinawa's economy relate to the higher rate of poverty?
この貧困が日本の他のところに対して沖縄貧困率が高いと思うんですけども、この沖縄のエコノミー経済の発展っていうのはこの貧困とどう関わってくるんですかね。
これは今、沖縄県のご指摘の点は大きな問題だと思っています。マクロ経済的には GDP は増えているんですが、その格差、所得格差が進行していまして、沖縄貧困率、残念ながら全国一です。そういう意味で、この今はまずはトータルに経済を上げていって、その後に分配の問題が出てくるという理解しています。
So while the GDP of Okinawa is going up, there is still a gap within Okinawa, economic gap within Okinawa. So the challenge for Okinawan government and Okinawa will be to think about equal distribution once we further lift the Okinawa economy.
Okay.
5 minutes. Maybe we can take maybe a few more questions.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful talk. And I'm just wondering, so when the military, when the U.S. military, when they were gone, were there any voices from Okinawa that want to retain the facilities for the future tourism purpose? And the reason why I'm asking that is because in Taiwan we have so many islands they have fortress built on, and those islands have been preserved, and nowadays it's kind of like a very big part of the tourism industry that has built upon those former military facilities.
この返還された土地のこの基地の土地でその場所を使って観光に役立てていけるっていう考え方を考えられている人たちってもいるんですかね。
どこにビジネスを作るかというのはこれはもう経済のマーケットメカニズムの論理なんですけど、さっき話したようにほとんどの跡地利用地域がホテルとか商業施設とかいろんなのが入ってきて、さっき示した通りで長い間そこ使えなかったのが使えるようになったことによって沖縄の推進力になっているということです。今
じゃあ基地をそのまま残してその基地を観光地に基地を使って観光地にするっていうのはそうですっていうのはあるんですかね。
道の駅みたいなの、
この基地を使った観光っていうのはあるんですかね。
そういう一部話ありますけど、それは観光化はまだされてないと思いますね。風の基地の大きなファイターとか見る場所はありますけど。
そうですね。So there's not much, I guess, like effort in that direction to use military bases, former military bases as tourist sites. But for those who are coming to Okinawa, we will visit some bases and see there are some spots where you can view military bases from there. So there are some sites that kind of local people visit to kind of experience and see the military bases. But at the government level, there's not much talk about if we can use the military bases as tourist sites.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's been great to learn more about the current situation and the way things have changed in Okinawa economically. Has there been any discussions, and this kind of follows on Kyle's question, about concerns about the distribution of income in Okinawa and using tourism as a potential way to develop the economy in the future? Because tourism as an economic development strategy often can make income inequality worse, and also has a lot of leakage, right, where a lot of the money kind of leaves the community. And I guess the short question is, has there been any proactive thought or discussion about doing tourism in Okinawa in a way that might be a little different than other places so that it's more equitable?
この観光によってさらに経済を発展しようという中で、先ほど言いましたみたいにこの経済のこのギャップっていうか、この発展する中で経済の不平等性みたいなのが出てくると思うんですけど、それをこの観光を通してやっていく中で、この不平等性をなくすような観光の促進っていうのを話されたりしているんですかね。あと観光で言ったらこの沖縄にお金が残るだけじゃなくて他のところに出ていくこともあると思うんですけども、そういう観光を通しての促進の中でどうこの平等性のある発展の仕方っていうのを考えておられているんですかね。
沖縄の貧困率は残念ながら全国一高いんですよ。でそれについて県庁にいるときにいろいろ考えたんですが、まずはそのマクロ経済としてボリュームを上げていく、その次にその分配を考えていくと。でというのは分配というのは社会政策も入ってくるものですから、そういうこともあるし、ただ例えばホテルは非常に賃金安かったんだけど、ラグジュアリーのホテルが出てくるとそこの賃金も上がっていくしという形で、そこのタイムラグがあるんじゃないかなと思っています。まずはマクロ的に拡大していって、そして分配の問題に取り組むというにはステップバイステップでいかなきゃいけないんじゃないかなと思っています。
So he sees that there are some steps that Okinawa needs to take, and with a first step, Okinawa needs to deal with the macro level economy development, and as economy improves, there will be more job opportunities and other benefits from the development of Okinawan economy at macro level. And one of the examples he's talking about is as Okinawa has more luxurious hotels, there will be jobs even for Okinawans with high pay, so that as Okinawa receives and has more tourist resources and finances, and having more hotels such as, like hotel, there will be benefits that the people in Okinawa can also experience. So from the Okinawa government perspective, first, we need to deal with the macro level, and the benefits will be experienced also by people in Okinawa.
1本あります。1、2本あります。1分だけ。Okay. Finally, I'd like to introduce a very small story about Okinawan traditional culture. In our ancestor believed in utopia. We say Nirai Kanai exists beyond the ocean because Okinawa is such a small island. Happiness, wellness, and civilization came from the ocean. So that's why they believed in existence beyond the ocean. And they thought we should not push back the visitors, but always welcome. This is Okinawan spirit. And at that time, it happened, and disease. This they say it was a smallpox, and spread over the whole island. But at that time, they have, of course, no medical care. But all they can do is just pray to get out from the island. What surprising, Okinawan people, our ancestors, composed a song admiring this disease, and sang a song with a traditional musical instrument, sanshin, and pray to get out from the island unconsciously, not push back. It is very dangerous nowadays, because it is defenseless, as you know. But I'm very, very proud of our traditional culture. So some of our audience visiting to Okinawa, we're waiting for your coming. Always welcome. Thank you very much.
We will have coffee break until 11, and we have another keynote speech.
So we're at time, but we'll give it another minute or two for people to come back in from coffee. If you could bear with us for another couple of minutes. Thanks. Okay, so welcome back, everyone, fueled with coffee, to our third keynote speech of the morning. We're delighted to be able to hear from Professor Akihiro Iwashita. So Professor Iwashita began as an expert in Sino-Russian relations. From the early 2000s, he's been applying the lessons learned from the border demarcation agreement between China and Russia to Japan's territorial disputes. Initially, the northern territories, subsequently also Dokdo and Senkaku island disputes. From 2008, he headed up the Global Center of Excellence program on reshaping Japan's border studies, which involved many travels to Japan's various islands, probably all of them. In 2012, he organized the Border Regions in Transition Conference in Fukuoka and Busan, So this was a cross-border conference that also involved stopping off on the island of Tsushima that exists between Japan and Korea. Today, and he, in 2016, he was the president of the Association for Borderland Studies. So we're delighted to have Professor Iwashita share his thoughts with us. I'd advise everyone to strap yourselves in. It's going to be quite a wide-ranging presentation, but we're very much looking forward to it. So, Professor Iwashita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ted. So always before lunch session is better than after lunch session. But of course, the 2 points, good points, bad points. The good points, many people comes to get lunch. But bad points are people want to eat lunch earlier, so it's hard for you to hear me at the end of the session. But I wish my food is much delicious than real lunch. So please start. Okay, this is the title, my papers. At the beginning, I just comment on my term of geo-politics. So Professor Yamasaki is most proponent in Japan of this term of geo-politics. The difference between hyphen without hyphen means that usually geopolitics, in the traditional term, just like a state-centered. And also, it's a big power eyes. So the small guys, small countries, locals are just kind of cheap, like chess. But our geo-politics is completely different. The geography could be changeable, and geography not be fixed always, and also need to locals and the small space views up to sky. So if you are interested in the concept, do not ask me. Ask Yamasaki-san later. So my papers, factually, I should say, because my position are the really studies center of Russia. But fortunately, our center's name, Slavic Eurasian Research Center, no one pay attention. We center on Russia. So now we try to save Ukraine against Putin. But nevertheless, these 1 years, I have been hung by Russian issue because of international relations, Russian foreign policy research at the beginning. So if you look at my capsule of the web, I just write about Russia issue, fundamental challenge to the world order, and Russia destroyed order. It helped initiate it. But it's not so relevant to Ireland. Therefore, here is the Ireland study session. I do not explain anymore. If you are interested in my thesis, our Eurasia border reviews, I have 2 contributions. You just Google EBR or Eurasia border review and Iwashita. Just 1 minute expression. The most important thing, the post-Cold War ended. It's a bit hesitate to clarify the new Cold War begin because of the difference from the first Cold War. But it's kind of hypothesis. But anyway, so the 2 ice age, between 2 ice age, Cold War 1 and 2 in the currently beginning. So this is a happy 30 years post-Cold Wars. I temporarily named interglacial period. So today's discussions basically on the interglacial period. You keep it this happy 30 years. What happened, particularly inland borders, ocean and river borders. This is the thesis today. And of course, we should think of the Cold War II phenomena. So the thinking of that current situation, we should discuss of the interglacial period. So in one word, geopolitical trends, geo-political trends in Eurasia and the interglacial period after Cold War I and from before now. in one word, stabilizing inland borders and conflicting maritime borders. Very simple thesis. So if you look at the slice of the Eurasian continent, most of the contested place concentrated on the middle tiers. The particularly most important in the China-Russia borders, if you back the Soviet Union, it's 7,000 kilometers. Just the Russia-China part, it's 4,000 kilometers. This is my originated work in Happy 30 Years at the beginning. I traveled basically the borders. So probably you remember this island, Damansky Island in Russian, Chamber Island. So it's rockets in the middle of Ussuri River, below map 2. But this is a very, very tiny borders, less than 1 square kilometers. What is the importance? Mao Zedong attacked this because advantageous China. Because this small, tiny island crossed to the China land on the river. Also, and Russia, Soviet Union, they want to defend more important strategic place in the Kirginsky Island. Russia never look at the Damansky. Then Mao Zedong attacked at the end of 1960, the peak of Cold War period. But we widen the scales. Sometimes we just look at Damansky Chembao discourse, but 4,000 kilometers, 7,000 kilometers, Soviet, China is a very, very borderlands rivalry and factually conflicted. Most important point is map 6 place, near Khabarovsk. The name is Heyshersdao in Chinese, in Russia in the Bolshoi Ussuri skis. So here is a very, very important place because it's they battled owing to this Heyshersdao Island, 300 kilometers near Khabarovsk, but real battle place in the Chembaodao. So we should cover this kind of scales. And more important things, the under Gorbachev period and Yeltsin period, early 2000s, they finally settled down and cut half and half, divided islands. So you remember yesterday's Professor Brother Keynote's divided islands. He highlighted on the Heyshersdao. I wrote this. So they're very happy to see him in a physically first time I see because of much exchanges. And also, Heyshersdao had different memory. Probably you know the name of Raymond Milfusky. IGU International Boundary Research Unit, now directors here. So Milfusky is a very great map writer, the cartographer, and also he measured in the disputed solution. But I met him almost 10 years ago, just after the solution of this half and half, 50-50 solution on the dispute island. I asked him, you write map on this exactly with the State Department expertise. He agreed, but with regret, he passed away. Therefore, I continue to his work. So this is a map. If you have a good eye, you look at the center in the Russian church, but also the opposite side in it's east in Chinese character, the China's park. So this kind of ceremony in the happy post-Cold War period continues. So this is a map I draw on the basis of the Raymond's will, and also this map, if you are interested, by the Godfrey book. So, happy Cold War period, not only China-Russian relations. We are Japanese tourists. Go there in a hotspot. Here's the Russian places. Over there, Ussuri, it's a East China park. This is a very happy world. It ended. The center in the Russian, the curator of the museum, we are happy places. Also, the demarcation places, We are so happy. So the borders impression sometimes is very gloomy in the bad, like origin of evil. But I want to try to reconstruct the image of borders, more happy borders places. But these good days are already gone. So in glacial period, interglacial period, if we back, so the probably you forget my first thesis. Now inland is stabilized, the maritime zone is more conflictual. So such kind of phenomena. As you know, Russia want to keep North Sea, and China want to keep South Sea. This is a bit old story, almost 12, 13 years ago. But Robert Kaplan's shocking map appears in the Foreign Affairs. So today's my thesis is Ireland as a geo-political place for conflict or cooperation. First, border scales, unknown conflict space beyond the hot island. You now remember Damansky-Chembao episode. Some Cold War historians only concentrated on the hotspot, but geographically scales more wider, and another spot is more important. Secondly, construction. So why China-Russia could resolve the issue finally? Because they shared bad memory of Damansky-Chembao. In 60s, at the time of the Cold War, they truly used this Damansky-Chembao as a kind of enemy image, each other. But in happy post-Cold War period, they changed the mind completely opposite. Never repeat Damansky, never repeat Chembao. We should to settle down. So such kind of same island could be constructed, deconstructed, reconstructed. Bad orientation, good orientation. We should know this kind of many issues. Finally, geopolitics needs more border, like locals, small scales importance, particularly relevant to residents, peoples. So I now more pay attention to Japan issue because here is Japan. So here is the former director of Marching Plat IBRU. In this sense, I also happy to see here the new director to discuss together. So I invited him at the beginning of our global COE program, Borderland Studies, at the end of 2000. So this is an IBRU map. 3 red places. You know this is Japan's 3 spots: Senkaku, Diaoyu, Takeshima, Dutokto, and Northern Territories and South Korea. Japan always rejects the existence of territorial dispute with China. Korea always rejects the existence of dispute with Japan. But the IBU is very, very fair to keep 3 hotspots there. But if we back to the timeline on larger scale, there are not borders before. Do not think of, I'm not imperialist of Japan. Here's a map from the US Museum of that. So the 3 points I mentioned is not borders. Japan borders there. But after the World War, our territory is very shrunken. So the hotspot is in the near borders. But you imagine, yesterday, the one great local researcher says that Yonaguni-Taiwan relation. But those days, before World War II, Yonaguni never be borderlands. Tsushima never be borderlands. Even in the edge of Hokkaido, near Northern Territory, never be borderlands. Also, Ogasawara Bonin Islands, never be borderlands. So this thing that we should reshape the kind of construction, scales and construction. So our official now show that Japan is a great maritime power. It's very tricky. When I was born in 1960s, Japan was a small country because of the territorial water is small. But thanks to UNCLOS, the people's perception dramatically changed. With islands, so huge water place belong to Japan. They are now in the Japanese proud of we are big maritime powers like that. It's a complete change. I truly remember my childhood. We are small countries. And also, islands meaning is changed. If territorial water is narrow, many of islands located in the public sea. So sometimes it's a heavy burden for government to keep and develop. They do not care islands so much those days. But now, if you have island, you get see, island is a treasure for us. Such kind of changes now. But reality is different. Pink place is kind of contestable. And also some Japan seaside is overlap in the easy and the kind of joint management places. So it's a very realistic map. When you are interested in that, just check my book, Japan's Border Issues and Outreach. It's also there more widened. It's a places near West Japan, China, Korean places, like a joint fishery zone, joint shelf zone, but it's sometimes hinders in island issues. Comparison that before Russia's invasion, Japan-Russian relations very good, particularly Abe Shinzo's initiative, though we had territorial disputes. So those days, Russia, Japan agree to have territorial disputes between them. But now I skip that's what happened after that. But anyway, now no discussion about that issue because of the Russia's invasion and Japanese sanction against Putin. So if you look at that, Japan claims Etruf, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and Habomais. Habomais, it's a islets group. So we should say sometimes, Etruf, Kunashiri is a very bigger. Shikotan, Habomai is small islands. Particularly, it's Habomai Islands a bit smaller. You look at Suisho or islands, you remember, it's a very close to Japan's Nemuro Cape. Here is a question. Smaller Habomai islets, particularly it's a small Suisho and Senkaku and Takeshima. May I have a question? What is the largest islands for your imagination? If I ask you, if you think that largest island Habomai, please hand up. No. Okay, Takeshima, please hand up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Senkaku, please hand up. Oh, you are completely misunderstood size. I explain. Takeshima, 0.2 square kilometers. Senkaku, 5 square kilometers. Habomai, smaller, we say that. But all of the Habomai, 100 square kilometers. And even Suishoto is 12 square kilometers. And the center of the island, Shibotsu, it's 58 kilometers. It's amazing. Double size, bigger than Yonaguni Islands yesterday we discussed. Such kind of construction we should manage more. And in addition, Kunashiri Island, 1,050. And Etorofu, 3,000 square kilometers. Much bigger than Okinawa main island. So, difference the Kuril Islands, northern territories, from Senkaku and Takeshima, not only the scale. First of all, this is very close to Japan coast. We can visualize this Habomai Island, even Kunashiri. It was a bit far. And the difference was its kind of peoples. 15,000 Japanese people lived before before the World War ending. And now, same size Russian population lived. It's very different. And Takeshima, we can't look at, usually. Senkaku-daiyu, it's far from Ishigaki Island. We can't look at. And basically, no peoples. Of course, now in Dokdo, some military guys in the Korean side there. Invisible island. Visible and invisible, also different. Then you imagine that. So we want to have bigger sea, but we need island. Okay. But it's difficult for you to construct blue waves. Just waves. You can't construct. But if you imagine island, it's easily construct. This is our territories. Particularly invisible islands, easily be construct imagination. If we can visualize each other, we understand more realities of local people. Right? Such kind of difference is very important to discuss. So fisheries zone also very important. It's a real life in the northern territories. And this is from the North Up Cape Nemuro, over there Suisho Islands, Habomai. I sometimes try to cut how we solve the territorial issues. So this one example is how to manage the water between Russia and Japan. Also, island itself could be divided because of Heisha's the Bolshoi lessons. This is a very good challenge to island studies. Island could be divided. What's the sense in island studies? We should discuss on the closing section. So, I have 15 minutes. So this is a very good space because I would show 2 films at the last. So some participants are enthusiastic at tourism. So the geo-political tourism is a different from traditional geopolitics tourism because we are not state centers. We are not big power centers. We look at more people's life, not so nationalism. Even the place we visit, nationalistic place. So how to construct image border? Periphery, dead end, uncivilized seat of evil. No, our border studies guy try to say, border is a chance, border is a hybrid, border is innovative. So Ted introduced me as the organizer of Brit 12, Fukuoka, Busan. So this is a starting point of our border tourism year. Because we invited the 40 countries people all over the world and 200 people. We had a conference in Fukuoka and the chartered ship and by Tsushima border islands between Korea and to reach Busan. This is a high-speed vessels. People are very happy, particularly Russians is very happy because Tsushima is a very important place for Russia. You think that, oh, Russia was defeated by Japan in Tsushima in the Japan Sea battle. Yes, but different local good stories. Now they turn to the local issue. The people, Tsushima people, saves so many Russian soldiers after defeating. It's it's a momentum. So you look at the picture, it's a kind of memory for Russian soldiers. The 5,000 Russians are dead soldiers. All of the name was written in Russian in memorial. Therefore, Russian people is very, very moved to look at that. Factually, happy years integration world. When I was invited to the Baltic Club by Putin, I face to him and give letter come on to Tsushima to the overcome the Japan-Russian past. But of course, Putin never listened to others. I can show the Putin's back, but today I can't prepare. This is a memorial place of the kind of Russo-Japanese wars. So of course, after that, we traveled to Korea, and so all of the participants enjoy the Korean food and barbecue. Not only the Korean side, of course, I'm a Russian expert. So the Russian side is more important. From Wakana, it's the north edge of Hokkaido to Sakhalin. Now, all of the communication stopped owing to the Russian invasion. But happy years, we had good communication, including the local tourism. But now is a different time. So back to the realities after the integration period, trends in Eurasia. So the conflicting maritime borders, of course, it's a tendency, trends. But we are afraid of destabilizing land borders. Rather, we're drawing new fault lines, particularly Chinese, Russians, honeymoon, very serious impacted. And in difference with the post-Cold War, those days, so many colonies, the independence period, but now almost the sovereignty states in the world. It means that they are more stronger than before, then they do not listen to the Western voices so much. In reality, in this Asia, Japan, Korea, Singapore follow the sanction, but others are very cool. And India also, they want to make balances, so more complicated. So where the fault line appears, we do not know. But anyway, we should also prepare for the inland tensions. But as a researcher, always we try to find good aspects. Then we are very tired of the discussion disputes and invisible borders. Also the people's sphere of profit, each other, the residents beyond the national borders, with a different idea thanks to experiences of post-Cold War period, integration period. Before the integration period, no contact between Russian locals, Japanese locals on the disputed islands. But these 3 years, thanks to Gorbachev, they regularly visited each other to the communication and develop the mutual confidence. This is a very important point, even now Putin's aggression in Ukraine, the new Cold War. So final video I show, then the local voices, local scale is very important for the future. Oh, sorry. It's eastern edge of Hokkaido, Nemuro City, a well-known front of the occupied islands by Soviet Army at the end of World War II. Now you look at Habomai Islet, just 10 kilometers off Nemuro's Nosap Cape. Habomai, 100 square kilometers, is a group name of small islets. Japan criticized Russian illegal aggression over the Japanese original territory by ignoring the neutral pact then valid. Japan also claims for Etorofu, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and Habomai as northern territories. Here is Kunashiri Island, bigger and richer in nature. Almost the same landscape with Shiretoko Peninsula, Japan's World Heritage. Hideo Fukuzawa, when he was 5 years old, the Soviet army occupied his island Habomai. He was forced to exit home for Nemuro to escape the Russian repression. I asked him, what do you think of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? He answers, I was shocked on TV to watch a young tiny girl crying and shouting, I don't want to die. It reminds me of my old memory 76 years ago when Russia came to us. However, thanks to the 30 years of local contact between Russian islanders and us on the passport visa-free exchange Mikhail Gorbachev introduced, I really recognize Russian islanders as the same humans, rather good guys who love drinking and dancing as me. I love them. Just I hate the brutal leaders in Moscow. This is the real voice of the locals, they are former islanders of this Habomai Islets. So I finally repeat the 3 points in scales, deconstructions, and finally locals. If we discuss about the island issue or other special borders, we keep in mind it's a kind of geo-politics. Now, never the traditional, the hyper-geopolitics. So here is a map on the realities. We have so many challenges in North Korea, China, Russia, and also others. And also we have big water places. Finally, just a pitch, the recent book with Ted, and also Geo-Politics, in Northeast Asia, borrowing the Yamasaki-san's proponents. And thank you. I keep on time. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Iwashita, for a very rich talk with a good view of Japan's other islands. We've taken the focus slightly away from Okinawa here, but looking at the northern borders and so forth. So I am anticipating that will have provoked some reflection in the audience. So I think I'd like to first open it up to the floor, and if you're watching on the webinar, you can type your questions into the chat, and we will come to you in due course, but we'll see if there's anything from the floor first. Sorry, in the Q&A, I beg your pardon. In the Q&A, not the chat. Don't type in the chat. The chat will remain invisible. Type into the Q&A, and we will get to your question in due course. All right, so I would initially like to ask the room if you had any questions. Yes, so at the back, please.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this wonderful talk. My name is Ifo. I'm from Princeton University, third year PhD. Actually, I think your talk transformed my reading of the expansion of the Japanese empire, like historically, because I think previously, like most literature actually focused more, if they are talking about like Hokushin, like northern advancement, it's basically talk about the continent, right? It's about like Manchuria, it's about Korea, but it's not like barely they talks about islands. So I just wonder how your focus of islands, like border islands in the Northeast Asia, could transform the literature, which also focuses on the Northeast Asia, but basically majorly on continent. Thank you.
So this is a bit question tough for me, and usually we distinguish the continental issues from the island issues, but I think that if we really principle to space thinkings, we do not distinguish so much. This is my thesis. So, for example, if you think of North Korea seems like island. Because if you look on the globe in night, North Korea's part is dark without electricity. So South Korea is an island. So such kind of metaphor is very important, particularly I missed a question in the first session for you. I'm always eager to ask the migrant asylum researchers how do you think about immobile peoples? Peoples having asylum is fortunate for me. North Koreans, never be. Gaza people, it's difficult. Also, China, it's kind of Shinkan vehicles people are packed. So this is kind of blank of the world map, these places, but also more and more dangerous places. It's kind of a metaphor of island I could use. So in this sense, north, south, east, west, maritime, or of course maritime a bit different in the inland, but we can think of the similar tool to be compared more theoretically. I think why Yamasaki-san invites me, I'm thinking. Probably he wants me to deconstruct any discussion. Sorry, this is not the answer, but just back to you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have anyone else, either to take up the provocation, perhaps? Before you go on.
Thank you for your presentation. It's wonderful. And so my question is that from your presentation, actually we see the critical moment for us to focus on the island borders again, right? But at the same time, I'm thinking about because in your presentation, meanwhile, you also talk about right now, we also have to focus on the unstabling of the inland border. But in some sense, I'm thinking about there's another potential for us to think about reconceptualize border, the relationship between the so-called inland border and the island border or the maritime border. Actually, do you think there's a kind of mutual interactions between inland borders and the island borders and the maritime borders? Because theoretically, my own sense is that we don't really want to reification of kind of a binary opposition between inland borders and maritime borders again, right? So, for example, maybe the border of the NATO will directly affect the maritime borders in East Asian context. So, I'm curious about how do you think about that kind of issue? Thank you.
Yep. These questions are kind of be two mixtures. The first is kind of maritime island inland borders difference. Actually, why the inland borders crisis has come down during the happy 30 years, one of the reasons that people are exhausted of inland conflicts. People are developing the techniques, sphere of working activities, and the globe is the same, but the geography is narrowed factually. So in this sense, people are give up to the battle more in the inland. In contrast, ocean is invisible and new frontier. Of course, cosmos is also new frontier. And thanks to the high-level techniques developed, people's countries, states are rushed to borders, new frontiers. This is a kind of the logical continuation. People need borders, but place is changing. This is one of the reasons why inland borders conflicts are come down and maritime borders are born up. This is one reason. Island borders is a kind of more delicate issues. What kind of borders? Island borders. For example, the river borders, I asked the Godfrey, it's completely different because it's rivers. Usually people look at each other. It's a sphere of interest, locals. I think that they should manage it in any sense. But the remote islands, ocean, it's not so profitable locals. Even the fishery relations, the Ishigaki people don't care so much of Senkaku, frankly speaking. Okinoshima people don't care so much about Takeshima Dokdo. Because only small fishery look on. Of course, but in the context of nationalism, this is a frame up, constructed, or the land are weird. Okay, have you been there? No. You know what size? No, it's a bigger size. So nothing is like that. So island issue is kind of invisible relations of the human life, type A or more, the easily constructed. The former type is the river. The latter type, basically it's maritime. But some islands, even in the maritime zone, but close to main islands or others. Of course, it's conceptually close to river borders, islands. So anyway, we can discuss about this issue. So various concepts. This is the first question answers. Second question is more variable because I asked yesterday the Yonaguni Taiwan's presenters what you think about border islands. Yes, if we think that Okinawa, if we change the scale, Okinawa itself in the border islands. But if we narrow the scales, Okinawa may not border islands. So this kind of scale levels. So this is very important. I basically international relations, foreign policy people. It means that it's kind of a scale change can be used for international relations. For example, some country is border countries. Some country is not border countries. It's kind of Australia. So if we change scales, why the North Korea is so upset to the others? China, why so upset? Because 10 countries surrounded. Like, I think that if we use the scale more sense, including islands or incontinent, open maritime, we can discuss more fruitfully way, plus in the timeline issue and the construct issues.
Okay. Yes, so towards the back, if that's okay.
Thank you, Professor Iwashita. May I ask about the reception of Snake Island in the Ukraine conflict, how that was received in Japan in light of the Northern Territories, and your reflections on the importance of Snake Island. Usually, the Ukraine is far from Japan. People is more construct image of the good guy, Ukraine, bad cop in Russia. So they are not so interested in the realities of the how borders in Ukraine like that. You know, the Karl Schlegel, famous German historian, very familiar to Russia, Soviet. He was given medal by Putin, but he refused to that in 2014, like the Crimean annexation there. So he says that very interesting. Ukraine is a borderland states because in so many empires and also locals mixtures of miniature of Europe like that. He says that he's expert on Russia, but he confessed that he never recognized very different Ukraine from Russia. We are the same. Even I were the Russian experts. I'm not so interested in the Ukraine itself, but recently completely changed. So in this sense, we are now learning process of realities of Ukraine. I'm sorry to say not so much about that because of that reason. It's sorry to we do not discuss that issue.
Okay. Yes, Professor Steinberg.
Thank you. Really interesting talk, and I think made me think about a lot about maritime versus inland versus island boundaries and where they fit into relations to each other. But my question, actually, watching the first video, I kept thinking that to the Russians, either probably the Russian state in Moscow, but even locals, how did this not look like Japan trying to reclaim southern Sakhalin? Listening to the tourists, the Japanese tourists saying, I now connect to this space. I feel my heritage here. I almost what that one woman almost sort of said, I want to reestablish that monument that I'm now reading. And I mean, to some extent, that's kind of an empirical question, simply how is this done in a way that did not appear threatening? But that speaks to maybe that broader sort of tension in a border that while it certainly has a potential for bringing people together, it also is even in that interglacial period, was a site of some conflict. And how are you able to transcend that?
Okay. Thank you for the question. So when we back to our timeline of border disputes, after the San Francisco Treaty, we have so many issues, territorial issues. Most important issue was Okinawa Islands. Second big issue was Ogasawara Bonin Islands. So then these days, we forgot that because Okinawa is back even in any form with military presence of the United States. In the process, some place remains open. This is the current place, 3 places. Sakhalin is a very unbelievable point, but Japanese side concentrate only on South Kurils appeals. Because the San Francisco Treaty, Japan gave up all of the Sakhalin clearly. But in the Kurils, Japan says that the Kuril Islands give up. But Japan says that Northern Territory Place, Etoro, Fukunashiri, Habomashi, Kotan, was not Kuril parts that mentioned. This is the logic of the legal points of view. In that sense, in Japan, could not claim South Sakhalin. This is one point. Second point, but nevertheless, Russia, Soviet Union, and Japan failed to make a peace treaty in the middle of 50s. What it means that we have no demarcated border. In Japan says, we gave up South Sakhalin, but we never recognize this is a lost Soviet territory. It's kind of blank. It's different. The Kurils, Japan claims. The Sakhalin, Japan not recognized. But factually happy 30 years. Factually, our foreign ministry, Aso Taro, visited Yuzhino-Sakhalinsk. It means that factually Japan recognized Russian territory, even not de jure. Then, in those days, early 90s, Sakhalin's military port is open. The Wakkanai was also militarized port, excluding Russians, but open. Then the ferries exchange promoted. This is a real local cooperation, communication at the beginning of post-Cold War period, early 90s. Therefore, most of Japanese just missed all memory of Sakhalin. And Sakhalin is a very short period. Just 40 years, from 1905 to 1945, 40 years memory. In the Kuril, it's more like that. So such kind of difference, people are already just enjoy the old memories. For peoples, they do not care the territory, which side, just they want to visit and enjoy the places. So this is never nationalistic orientations. So this is a good point because the overcoming nationalistic. Sakhalin is like a Vyborg, the Finn and Russia's.
Okay, do we have, I think we've got time for 1 or 2 more, if there's anything else from the floor. Paul?
Thank you. So I completely accept your point that the Northern Territories are sort of different to Dr. Takashima and Sekiro Jiao because they're bigger, as you say, but also because people live there, right? There were evacuees who are still alive, as you showed in your video, and that makes the stakes higher. What happens when they die? Like when this generation, because the last people who remember this are getting old now. So what happens to the politics of the dispute after that generation passes away?
This is a very important question. The average there, over the 85, almost in 5-10 years, no first generations. Second generation has a different idea. Please imagine, even you, this is a father's, mother's homeland. Do you want to really be back and live there? Remote islands, particularly under long time under control Russia, no infrastructure. They never want to be back. Just they want to travel and short stay. So this is a truly issue that the Japanese government be afraid of. They try to develop second generations, third generations former islanders, but they never follow that orientation. But this is one of the good points in a local level. People's or more important thing that go together each other back and forth and the usual life and shares interests, trade, communication, visit, enjoy the life. But Putin cut down this. Completely no communication now. All of the local arrangement under these 30 years, happy years, finished. So this means against the new fault line appears. But as I show the film, people still have a memory of 30 years communication. If we have 10 years or 20 years more, it's done, gone. But now they keep the memories. Opposite side, they are humans. We know them, each other. This is the most important to diffuse the tensions. Therefore, I think that the interglacial period experience is very important for any conflict of the borders, including islands, to change more positive, constructive orientation.
Okay, so we are about at time, unless someone wants to dive in with a desperate plea before lunch. But otherwise, I think Professor Iwashita has given us plenty to chew over as we move into the break. So I hope you'll join me in giving him a big hand.
Thank you for keeping patience for your hunger.